rather than physically. So welcome back. Um, as I mentioned, we are going to now go on to kind of more impact measurement of actually what all that really great work that was done in Bristol, what it meant and how it and how it kind of came to being and how it kind of moved on from there and what we can do and what we can reflect on it. So I'd like to invite Patricia Lucas of the University of Bristol, who did a piece of research for us, and Maurice Rosso, who I suspect most of you know, and he still can't get back to Australia. He's still stuck with us, the former director of Feeding Bristol, to take you through that. They're also sharing their own slides, so they will work through that one. So Patricia and Maurice, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chrissie. So just before we start, I want to help set the scene. A lot's happened over the last 10 months, and Patricia and I will be providing some insights and reflections on how we responded as a city in feeding the most vulnerable, really on those first 3 to 5 months, so that first lockdown, that into the summer holidays. I don't want to reopen any wounds. It was a tough time, it is a tough time, but the main aspects of that first part of last year that I want you to consider and reflect on is how fast everything seemed to change back then and how uncertain we all were. Whether you were on the front line, volunteering, working for a business, or you'd been furloughed, no one knew what was going to happen the next day, let alone the next week or month. So from a planning and strategic point of view, it really made things challenging. Considering that, what the city achieved, it was by no means perfect, but considering those circumstances, the strategy that Feeding Bristol coordinated and that was then delivered by charities and community groups working at a grassroots level, considering that, what was delivered was amazing. And it was an amazing level of unity and collaboration. And we talk collaboration a lot, and it is really successful and it's been great. I want to take it to the next level. Our cohesion and partnership was what really stepped up. It's no longer collaboration, what we do in Bristol, it's proper partnership. Especially when we think back to pulling the citywide food strategy together, at the start of that first lockdown, we really had no idea of the scope or what to do. It was really about understanding who was accountable, as in which groups, for supporting which vulnerable groups. And then we had to fill the gaps somehow. So it wasn't as simple as you might expect. Different groups that works with different vulnerable groups, say the elderly or young care leavers, they didn't necessarily focus on food. So there was another aspect as far as engaging with those organisations and helping them link into food and how their beneficiaries could then access that food as well. So it really was a citywide effort to reach the most vulnerable people as possible. And of course, people got through the gaps, unfortunately. I'm going to give a bit more detail about the summer school holidays and how we helped to support over 2,000 vulnerable children. But before that, I'm going to pass over to Patricia Lucas, who a couple months into the first lockdown, we reached out to help us do a review of the food support across Bristol, not just Feeding Bristol strategy, but the city as a whole, and really looking into and evaluating what worked well and what didn't as well. So over to you, Patricia.
Thanks, Maurice. And thanks to all the contributors this morning already who've been incredibly inspiring, to the Elizabeth Blackwell Institute and to Feeding Bristol, who funded the research that I'm about to talk about, and to everybody who took time out in what was already an overwhelming time to talk to us. And I've just got a couple of slides showing some people's voices. I'm mostly just going to speak. We have a lot more that we can say, and we've been talking to Feeding Bristol about what things we can learn, reflecting on the rapidity of that kind of early crisis response. But they're just, so I'm just going to highlight really a couple of things. If there are other things you want to know about, please get in touch. We spoke to more organisations than I'm going to mention today. So, as Maurice said, this was in the context of that really intense early period where no one knew what was happening. And I, as a researcher with a strong interest in food welfare, kind of went, well, what's the part that I play? And the answer is, what I can do is help think about what can we learn during this period. So between July and sort of late October, we interviewed organisations who were providing a range of different food support in the city. So that's sort of just post lockdown 1 and just pre-lockdown 2. So it was an interesting time to be talking to people. We talked to the kind of organisations you've been hearing about already this morning: food clubs, people providing meals, ready-cooked meals and frozen meals, food parcels, and those are not, as you've already heard, just food banks. Particularly during this period, there were a number of organisations that traditionally provided a different kind of service, but because they couldn't, because of lockdown restrictions, they turned themselves to meeting the immediate need of the people, the communities they work with, and provided parcels different kind. We spoke to education providers who had a really interesting time of it, because over that period of time, most of them had some variation of meal, parcel, and then voucher provision as national policy changed. And I don't need to tell this group the rapidity and the unexpected nature of that changes. So they had a particularly interesting journey. And then we also talked to infrastructure charities. So those are charities both providing services for those organisations, and ones who play a coordinating role, who act mainly to connect and refer users to other sorts of services. So a range of locations, types of service, and also size. We spoke to some really small and quite big ones. And this is where I'm just going to quickly just share a couple of slides. So give me a moment of technical thing. I'm hoping that works. Go. So the first thing is just to reflect that those voices that you heard this morning are not unique voices from a small number of organisations. We heard really strongly this sense of pride and energy about the scale of what happened in those early months. It was a period where we just had to go for it. We knew it was going to be hard, and we knew we were going to be tired, but we just did it. And that's kind of what I'm most proud of. People really went over and above to make sure that the most vulnerable people were not hungry during that exceptional period. And key to that for many organisations was this cross-city coordination that we've been talking about. There were instrumental changes in bringing together resources in need really rapidly that both helped the organisations themselves and those they served. And there was a feeling amongst those who were part of that wasn't just about the fact that we are quite a small city and people know each other. It's also about a kind of willingness to be open and a willingness to collaborate. And most importantly, that what these new collaborations give you is what Maurice said, a kind of legacy for future work. We have new relationships and new ways of working, and that's really important for the future. But this was a crisis response, and it needed to be, but there are some consequences to that. So I was really moved listening to Kirsty this morning, but actually I heard that sort of moving account very, very often. So myself and Jill Foster, who I think is somewhere in the room, who did these interviews, were really, really the depth of emotional content in some of those interviews about what it was like to be working for an organisation during this period. I'm really tired emotionally and physically. It was very, very stressful, constantly trying to figure out new ways to make sure that we could support people. And you effectively have people's lives kind of perched in your hands for that brief moment. That sense that you're holding people's lives and the sense of personal responsibility. And it's really important to reflect on that, because we both need to be incredibly proud and grateful and really careful that we take care of our organisations and our staff and volunteers as well as our users. It's a really important message how much this period took out of people. We talked to people who had worked through weekends, had cancelled leave, or working ridiculously long days. It was a lot. And thank you to all of you. I don't know why it's not moving forward. There we go. The other thing is that people didn't go hungry, and there was a lot of good food circulating in the city. But where organisations were relying exclusively on donated food, they were restricted in their choices. And what was interesting for me is how much you saw that reflected in how organisations experienced as challenges of food insecurity in the way that individuals do. That sense that, so here's somebody who was working to provide parcels saying, don't get me wrong, we were really, really grateful for what we were able to provide, but it wasn't always really a well-balanced nutritional food. We weren't always able to meet all the nutritional and culturally appropriate needs of everybody. It's the nature of donated food here. And then lastly, I said schools went on a really rapid journey here, and here's one of the head teachers talking about where they got to with this. And I'm just going to read this in full, although it's quite long, because the feedback I got is parents could plan meals and actually be more economically savvy rather than being bound by what was in a food parcel, which is basically our choice. So for me, that's why I wouldn't go back to the way we did food parcels again. I think what vouchers did is empowered parents to be part of it, going full circle. Then when the children came back to school on the 1st of September, they looked like they'd eaten well. They'd tell us about some of the meals that they had. So I think the challenge for all of us is to absolutely recognise the importance of being able to respond to crises, and that is an important part of resilience. But also that as we look to the longer term, here we are in lockdown 3, and the economic consequences of the last year are not going to go away quickly. What we need to think about is sustainable responses and how we can have a realistic plan for this balance between long-term and emergency. Thank you. Back to Maurice now.
Thanks, Patricia. Really powerful, helpful stuff. All right, moving on specifically to the summer holidays 2020. So for those of you that don't know, Feeding Bristol's program for supporting vulnerable children and families during any school holiday is called Healthy Holidays. So as it is in the title, the emphasis is on supporting the positive health of children. There's an underpinning focus on food, but 2020's focus was a little different. There was so much food support going around anyway, off the back of all the COVID response work. Just for those that you don't know, there's a huge and disproportionate level of need of vulnerable children in Bristol. 22%, so over 14,000 children are eligible for free school meals. We use that as a proxy measure because it doesn't capture all the need. It doesn't include kids under 5 years of age, and it doesn't include kids who aren't in the system, and it doesn't include adults. But it's a strong number nonetheless, 22%. With that need, compound this with the early stages of COVID lockdown and the level of isolation that existed without schools operating, the general lack of support that exists during a 6-week summer school holiday anyway for vulnerable children. It's been proven to negatively impact their education. So kids who hadn't been to school already were already in the situation where they had been stuck at home and facing 6 weeks of further isolation.
Maurice, can I just interrupt you there? Patricia, can you just unshare your screen, please?
I enjoyed looking at that Windows experience. No, so
Thank
you. We knew as a group there was a dozen or so of us who were meeting regularly anyway. That's for those of you that know the Feeding Bristol Communities Working Group. It's a pre-existing relationship and group, and we knew that we had to do something. Whilst in 2019 there was a massive focus for Feeding Bristol in increasing the amount of food available in the city to vulnerable children, this year it was more about how do we provide support from a mental health and physical health level, whilst complementing that the food provision around Bristol. The strength of how Feeding Bristol operates within Healthy Holidays is that it supports the needs of the city at the time. So the progression from 2018 with a bit of food to the massive amount of food and partnership with Fair Share in 2019 to 2020, that level of partnership has grown over the last couple of years. And it's that pre-existing partnership that I emphasised in the first couple of minutes I spoke earlier, meant that where we only had 2.5 weeks to plan the 6-week summer holidays this year, we still got it done. So I'll just say that again. We only started actually planning the holidays. So pre-COVID, we started in January. But with COVID, we had 2.5 weeks before the holidays to put together the entire citywide program. Amazingly, within that time, because that included fundraising, we still managed to raise 155 grand. That was from local grant providers, from council and crowdfunding campaigns. Having raised 125 grand through similar methods last year, 2019, sorry, we didn't expect to do the same again. So that's a huge thanks and a huge reflection of Bristol's generosity. So thanks. The success of the program as a whole was achieved through 6 major strands of work. The reason they were successful again was because of the partnerships and those pre-existing ways of working, the way that we could just act quickly and get on with it. I won't cover all those strands of work today. There should be an impact report coming out shortly where you can see some more of those details. But again, I want to emphasize that the objective of this program, the Healthy Holidays 2020, was to alleviate pressure of families in most need. Social distancing guidelines meant that the capacity across the children and youth worker network, we just weren't going to be able to reach the same level as in 2019, where we reached 9,000 children. Think back to the number I said before, over 14,000 children on free school meals in Bristol. And we reached 9,000 last 2019, which was a huge effort. But we knew this year we just weren't going to be able to reach that same number. Therefore, we had to, unfortunately, be targeted to reach the most vulnerable, which is something we believe we did achieve. So I want to give you the two examples to take away from today regarding the holidays and the success stories from it. The first one being, the major method of reaching 2,000 children was through filling that capacity in organisations that were operating across the city. So unfortunately, a lot of youth and children organisations closed down and weren't able to work at that time. But those that were, we wanted to be able to enable them to work and fill their days with as much as they could. So that was basically supporting them to run the activities. And by doing so, them running the activities could link into the food provision that was already available across the city. And it meant that by Feeding Bristol providing support of running activities, those vulnerable children were also then being fed. And like I said before, that was in total reaching a little over 2,000 children. Now, Playful Bristol had a major role in being a liaison here between the grassroots organisations and Feeding Bristol. I'm going to go back to the fundraising, the 155 grand we raised. All of that only came through about halfway into the actual holidays. So again, you can imagine from a planning perspective, we couldn't release everything from day one. We couldn't say, here is the budget that we've agreed to, start of the holidays, go for it. And what I want to emphasize here is that trust that went both ways between Feeding Bristol and Playful Bristol and grassroots organisations. We were hoping that money was going to come through and we're working hard to do so, but it meant we could only release funds week to week. So what we did was exactly that. And we said to the groups, all right, here's the funds for week 1. Off you go, get into it. We'll let you know when we can approve week 2. And you can imagine the stress that causes from an organisation level of security and understanding what's coming. But the trust was there, and thankfully, because the funds did come through, it worked out, and we got to the end of the 6 weeks delivering the entire program. So thanks to all the 40-odd organisations who helped that happen. The second example I want to give is the information leaflet and the cooking videos. If those of you haven't seen them, highly recommend you jump onto the Feeding Bristol website under the Children's Kitchen, some fun little cooking videos there. My favourite is the paratha. But very quickly, just to describe it, this was a really inspirational way of working. What happened with that 2.5 week time frame before the holidays, that group of 12 or so organisations, it was we caught up without much of an agenda besides saying we need to do something for the holidays. One person came up with an idea, we expanded on it, and then a few of the experts took it away and came up with a model that then got executed within a couple of weeks. So within a 3-week end-to-end period, we went from creative idea to delivery and execution. It was absolutely amazing. What the leaflet did was it provided a guideline, basically, some examples of how that £15 free school meal voucher that a lot of families received. It gave them an example of how they could use that money for some groceries. Complemented to that were the cooking videos, multicultural recipes from your general public. They weren't professional chefs, and it was through that partnership of Feeding Bristol, Square Food Foundation, 91 Ways, and the Children's Kitchen that it all got put together. I should also thank a local translator company who translated into 16 different languages the subtitles for those videos, so that we could again reach the broadest audience, the most diverse audience. Another level of partnership in there that I want to emphasise is the work with the council, Bristol Council. Richard Hanks, looking after all the schools in Bristol, was instrumental in us getting that leaflet to all the schools. Again, think of that time frame, 2.5, 3 weeks. And in that time, Richard said, yep, get that leaflet over to me. We'll send it over to all the schools and we can get the leaflet to the families before they break up for the school holidays. I mean, talk about skipping the red tape and going straight for it. That was amazing. We wouldn't have been able to do that without the council's understanding of what we were trying to achieve and what they also wanted to achieve. So that was a great example of strong partnership that had been developed over these last couple of years and that Marvin spoke about at the very start of today. Just to wrap up, I want to remind you of that immense pressure everyone was under at the start and at this time. But it was working together in that true sense of partnership, cohesion, collaboration. We helped to improve the lives of 2,000 children. By no means did we reach everyone, and of course the challenge is getting worse. But the success of this project is one that we should be proud of as a city, and it's one that we should use as a template, as a way of working for moving forward. So thanks again to everyone who was involved. You've heard examples from the food clubs, from Kirstie's Scrap Store, about those guys who were on the ground delivering it. And it was with their effort and the 40 other organisations that we were aware of. And there were many more as well. It was through all their work that we were able to help some of these most vulnerable children and families through the last summer holidays. Back to you, Chrissie.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Patricia and Maurice. That's been great. A good summing up of everything. For anyone who wants more detail on the Healthy Holidays impact over the kind of the break between session 3 and 4, there'll be a presentation going up, rolling through. No talking, but just some good infographics and some stats going along with that one. So if you missed any what Maurice and Patricia were saying, it'll come up on that. Thank you for that. They were very good. They stuck to their time. We actually do have time for some questions to either Maurice or Patricia. So either put in the chat, or I can try and scroll through if you put your hand up or go onto video and just start talking. I think it's probably the easiest way for you if you just kind of unmute yourself and start talking to see if there's any questions coming through. No. Blinding silence. Quite often the way, isn't it? And I think actually this kind of format with lots of people kind of sitting around kind of does can make it slightly trickier as well. What I might do then, in case Andy has anything to add to what those two lovely people have said.
Add just the final point as well, Chrissie, just given the deafening silence.
Yep.
One of the things I cut out of my little talk there, but it was pretty valuable, is the cross-sector support and cohesion across the city. So that's private, public, and third sectors. And so in 2019, we spoke about having spent, I think it was 100 grand on the project and delivering 500 grand worth of value. And that was due to in-kind donations and volunteering support. This year, we still managed to out-deliver our spended value. So it wasn't by as much, but I think from the 150 grand spent, it was about 80 grand more than that in value. again, because of the in-kind donations. There were activity packs supported, ingredients discounted here and there. It was just amazing. Like, the support from the city, as soon as we went to a business and asked for help, it was very rare that we got a no. So again, just a huge reflection on how the city works together.
Yep, brilliant. I'm astounded by every time I kind of keep hearing stories about it, or seeing videos about it, or hearing people talk about it, just how much the city did pull together. And I think each time I get a bit jaded, it kind of find it more re-inspiring again.
I just have a tiny shout out.
Yep.
So it's just to say that when I was talking, obviously today I wanted to particularly focus on the fantastic contribution of Feeding Bristol, but I just, in this moment, a little shout to we spoke to organisations who were not part of that network and were working independently in very much the same ways. And it's back to that kind of the breadth of the response was truly quite something, to the scale of different organisations who turned them around. So just a thanks to all of those too who were continuing or beginning to work in ways that they never had done before.
Excellent, thank you. So in that
Chris,
case,
I'll ask Maurice a question. I'll put him on the spot before
when's he going back?
Yeah, before he goes back to Australia, it matters, or even to Patricia of what we've been thinking about and what we've been talking about for the past. And we have been looking at the past and looking how we've stepped up and how, quite rightly, a collaboration has moved to a partnership. And we're talking about sort of, the building blocks and everything for for a resilient food system. What building blocks perhaps were missing? What building blocks could have made it even stronger, perhaps, over the last 6-9 months? Any thoughts, Maurice?
It's really to do with the reach and the quality, I suppose. Patricia mentioned the culturally appropriate food, and she just mentioned there are other organisations who worked outside of kind of our known bubble. So it wasn't really a bubble. Our net is quite large and it's growing. I think to get that next level in that improved food system in Bristol, it's you don't want to rush it. So I'd say the rate of growth that's already existed and getting more organisations involved is there, but what's missing is that everyone's included. And when I say everyone, that's at an organisation level, because every organisation has a different priority. And Feeding Bristol has those 4 key strategic priorities, which is pretty all-encompassing. But there are still other issues out there. We talk about food, but that's essentially, to me, a consequence of other levels of equality. So the more this can link into other aspects of policy reform and big picture change, then the more equality will develop and the less need of kind of direct food support will exist. Does that answer your question, Steve?
Thank you.
Steve,
we have
Chrissie, can I respond too?
You can. We have one question coming up as well. Yep.
Okay. So it is a really great question. And I've got 2 things to say, one of which builds on the second thing that Maurice was saying, which is the word I want is preventability. So I was thinking about what makes a crisis, and this subtle thing about when the COVID crisis itself was neither preventable, although it was to some extent predictable, but for many of the people who were pushed into crisis by it, that was entirely predictable and preventable. And so Maurice says that even as he says, even as we respond to the kind of immediate crisis of hunger, keeping in mind that this is a long-term crisis of failing to prevent people falling into those circumstances, and therefore the solutions should reflect what we really need to do at a structural level as well at the individual level to I think is really important. And I know that work was already happening, so it's not exactly a gap, but I think this is a moment for the strategy that's coming forward is really important as building some momentum from that crisis. And the other one is, and I know that this is because I'm a researcher, but it's about data. So one of the things, because of the scale and the rapidity and the great range of things that happened, what's really difficult to get a picture of is a kind of unified picture of reach and impact, and the balance between gathering information in ways that are not just additional administrative burden. So we definitely heard from organisations who'd received central government funding in particular, where the reporting restrictions were such that they in themselves were just another burden. They didn't help organisations to understand for themselves how well their work was happening. And so I think a bit of a work as a kind of citywide community about how we can build a good information gathering structure that supports both the citywide and the individual in organisations and individuals, I think is a kind of really, for me, is quite an important gap.
Thank you. And noted, we'll have a look at that one. Thank you very much. That's great. And I just think the work that Feeding Bristol does, one thing that has been sort of acknowledged the fact, but we do lack some of that kind of measurement, and across the city we have good pockets of it, but not so good elsewhere. Yeah. Eileen, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, throughout this morning, I'm forcibly stunned, as I think everyone must be, by the way the one city approach has reacted and coped with this problem. Yes, there's more to do, but they've dealt with it, as you say, feeding 2,000 children and their families, and the absolute debacle of the government's response, not only to COVID, but obviously, as we said, to feeding children in school holidays as a basic. And even highlighted this morning by the total lack of a strategic response, for want of a better word, to handing out, you know, the IT needs of and recognising the IT needs of children. So the government response has been shambolic. Bristol's we can be proud of, I really feel, I think everybody can. Is there any way after this that the Department of Education could be open to learning the lessons that Bristol is showing? How to, you know, if you want to get out laptops and you know, increase availability of all of that, many of the hard-earned lessons, and they were hard-earned, I'm not minimising that, of how, as Maurice has said, how to ramp up in 2.5 weeks and the pressure, but they did it. You delivered, so feel proud, everyone. Whereas the government, you're looking at their response and it's more holes than net, actually. So is the Department of Education open to learning, I suppose, to get to my question? How to do it? Learn how to do it.
I'm going to pass over to Andy on this point, because I know that it's actually sometimes they have been in touch with the Department of Education. So I'll just hand over to Andy, if that's okay for that one.
I was trying to be brief, because that question, that point was very well made, and raises sort of heckles to me, I guess, because I guess up until this last year, we had for 2 or 3 years with the Healthy Holidays programme been badly let down by government. And it was because government failed to provide funding for a really well crafted strategy for the Healthy Holidays programme that we went to the city, and the city responded remarkably in terms of providing the level of support, not just financial, but volunteer and so forth. In some regards, it's a bizarre thing to say, in some regards, the fact that government didn't support meant the city had to come together. Now, I'm not advocating that as a way of getting the city to work together, just for government to fail. But I do think we're in a very strong position now, and we are intending, with Marvin's help and others, and I noticed Kerry McCarthy is on the call. Kerry has been a huge supporter of ours, local MP, passionate about food insecurity and food injustice, and has been a huge supporter of ours over the last few years. And we do need to get that message back to government, that there are ways of doing it. The one city approach, the way that we bring a city together and open-handedly work together without agendas, without egos, in a way that is putting people who are at risk of going hungry first. I think there's some lessons to learn, and so I do hope we get that opportunity. Currently, you know, we're in another lockdown. I think the one we did learn lessons, and Tricia's right, we didn't get it right all the time during that first lockdown. But actually now, 9-10 months later, we're in a much better position. And that experience that we had meant that relationships were forged, connections were made, resilience was put in place, which wasn't there at the beginning. And we're in a much stronger position, not just for now, and you might hear me say this later, this isn't just about crisis. We're here, of course, to respond in crisis, but we're here also post-COVID to look at putting in place something that's going to address those issues of inequality and injustice over the long term. And we want to see real systemic change. That will take time, but we're learning lessons, not just for now in crisis, but I hope building relationships and ways of doing things which will really make a real difference in the longer term too. Thanks.
That's great, thank you. And now we're pretty much spot on time. There is one question from Isabella, and perhaps either Maurice or Andy could answer that one directly on the chat function. That'd be great, thank you. I know Andy's sort of left, not Andy, Maurice left Feeding Bristol a few months ago now, but I'd just like to say, sort of in this kind of forum, so thank you for all his work he's done in Feeding Bristol. Very much instrumental in actually moving us forward to a position where we are where we can actually now even drive for further forward in kind of what we want to do across the city, building on so much stuff that has happened before, and working with all the main people and not so main people in Bristol, but just bringing everyone together. That's great, thank you. Thank you to Patricia and Maurice for that. That was really cool, thank you. We are now going to move on to another quick break. You have about